Okay, so this video kind of wraps up the introduction section, really. We've spent a lot of time talking about that, but as I've talked about before, the introduction section is one we want to spend a lot of time on because obviously you want to put your best foot forward, and it's kind of your greeting card to the reader. And to polish this all off, we're going to talk about a concept that is a little bit abstract to a lot of people, but hopefully we'll talk about it in a way that is accessible and kind of concrete to you guys. And that is the concept of what's called authorial voice. In this case, authorial academic voice. So we're talking about what is this concept of an academic voice and why does it matter, and how to avoid losing that voice. And again, hope to do this in a way that's very sort of practical for you. So it is easy when we talk about um, this conversation that one enters when establishing territory and building up a rationale for one's research. Since you are drawing on other people's work to get lost in a crowd, um, and you are not writing a Wikipedia article, you're not just reporting on what's out there. You want to insert your voice in that discourse, and so you have to somehow stand out. Your voice needs to be recognizable and not just obviously report on other people's research. And you need to let that voice stand out from the crowd. You need to let your voice be heard clearly. And so, how do we do that? So, I'd like you to, in the following text, consider: is it clear what the I say is? Um, remember the they say I say? Is the I say clear here? And here is the text, and we'll read it together just quickly. Dearden 2014 has asserted that English as a medium of instruction is a growing global phenomenon. Ernesto Maccaro showed that EMI has not yet been widely studied in the discipline of applied linguistics. In fact, in his book, he reports finding a total of 16 total published studies on EMI before the year 2000. ARE 2016 has stated that little is understood about EMI and other related English teaching scenarios such as content and language integrated learning and English for academic purposes. All right, so I mean, aside from a couple of weird typos in this paragraph here, uh, this is also kind of a good example of bad authorial voice. And why that is that first of all, I am foregrounding too much the authors. I'm giving them too much of a voice. If you notice, every single sentence here begins with an author. And this is a very common issue I have found in authors reporting, especially in the introduction section when they're establishing territory. And this is not really they say, I say. This is more like he said, she said. And the author's voice has been lost. It's all very Wikipedia-like. So you have to remember that uh, you are and you will have a thesis, and you also are responding, and your voice has to come in as a response to the conversation. You're responding to a conversation, then you are in constructing your arguments, you are entering a conversation. You are not eavesdropping. You are actually entering the conversation as a participant, as an interlocutor in that conversation. Uh, Christine Casenev talks about this in her reflections as how she became a writer um, in a piece called Narrative Braiding, constructing a multi-strand portrayal of self as a writer, And she says, if I wished to contribute to knowledge in my field, I needed to see my published writing as part of ongoing conversations with other published writers. So she also refers to this conversation, and she came to realize this, that if you want to be a contributor to the knowledge, which is what you ultimately all are doing now and want to be recognized as doing, is contributing to the knowledge in your field, not just consuming that knowledge, but contributing to the knowledge. You need to see your writing as part of that conversation, that you are in dialogue with that. That is the they say, I say. And therefore, she says, I needed to situate my work in relation to other published voices. And that means she's saying she needed to look at herself um, as the center of that conversation, really. And that might be hard to do if you go back to that notion of the kind of commonplace imposter syndrome that can exist among especially early career researchers and grad students, where they've spent a lot of the time of their academic life as consumers of research and not really seeing themselves as being contributors to knowledge in their field. And so if you can imagine the metaphor of you, a contributor to the field in dialogue, is that imagine you being in a sort of pivoting armchair, and you have these people around you who have different opinions about a particular subject, and you're kind of pivoting and talking to them, and even maybe adjusting your wheeled and pivoting chair to come closer to those authors and connect them their ideas in some way. You're situating yourself at the center of the discourse. Um, you're situating your work in relation to those other voices, basically. Further, she says, I consider this goal of situating my work in relation to what others have said to be the single most challenging and important aspect of learning to write for publication. And I can see that that would probably be the most challenging thing for a lot of people. And we're talking about a native speaker here writing in English for English medium journals. You can imagine that for somebody for whom English is not a first language, it may be even more challenging. But the point is that I can understand that this is one of the most challenging aspects of learning to write for publication, because it's an ongoing construct that evolves as a function of your participation in a community of writers, empowering yourself to feel like what you have to say is important enough to be recognized as uh, equally value or even greater value to what has already been said before in the area that you're writing in, uh, and to evolve to transform from a consumer of knowledge basically to a contributor of it. And it's not something that you can just snap your fingers and make it happen magically. It's something that takes time. Another interesting point that she makes is, she said, I did not understand this notion of academic conversations via publications for much of my graduate school time. I did not know what it meant to be scholarly, but I knew that I had to refer to work that had already been published, and that the authorities had to be cited somewhere early in the paper. There also had to be enough citations to give the reader the sense that I knew something. I used to count the number of references in the reference list. I felt satisfied if I could reach the arbitrary number of 15. And so there's a lot to unpack here, but first of all, that last statement that she makes, as a teacher of writing, I recognize this as true, that students will sometimes ask, well, how many references should I have in my paper? And there's no real answer to that. It all depends on what the conversation is and how you are using those other voices to support your thesis, the main point, the unique selling point of your article. And there is a lot of there's a notion, and I think it's reinforced a lot through high school and so on, that there's a kind of perfunctory need to cite sources. But what I hope you get out of this video, by the end of this video, is that uh, citing sources is not something that that is required because of some demand from some formal demand to show that you've read necessarily. It's more that you need to articulate your contribution with that which has already occurred, and that articulation, at the end of that articulation, it's your voice that should emerge. You talk about the they say, and then your I say should emerge clearly in that conversation. So let's go back uh, to, and again, this is to reinforce the idea that your authorial voice arises out of this membership in a community. Let's go back to that problematic or that paragraph that lacked authorial voice, where you talk about the authors and their works. Um, how would that look if it was written differently? Well, if you were to include more authorial voice, first of all, you wouldn't have each sentence begin uh, foregrounded with what other people have done. Instead, you would try to weave that into your I say, what they say, but with your I say inserted in it. So look at the difference here. In the first sentence, highlighted in light green, it now goes without saying that English as a medium of instruction in higher education, where English is not the usual language of education, is a widespread and global phenomenon. So if you go back to the original, the first one, you just have what she said, what Julie Dearden said in 2014, and that's it. Here, you have a kind of position where the person is claiming centrality and says not just what was said or what they said, but kind of adding their own attitude toward their own stance, their own position to this, and saying, well, it now goes without saying, and this is adding their own flavor to that statement. It now goes without saying that English as a medium of instruction in higher education, where English is not the usual language of education, is a widespread and global phenomenon. So here, instead of this is what Julia Dearden said, you're saying this is what I am saying, and and this is also supported by these other people here. And then you, instead of foregrounding those people, um, you're just using them to say, and this is me and my peeps, other people who have said something similar, and you're just making that assertion and using those voices, those other authors, to bringing them into the conversation because they deserve to be part of the conversation. They were there already. The second sentence, which was originally Ernesto Maccaro, 2018, showed that EMI has not yet been widely studied in the discipline of applied linguistics. Well, now if you look at this light blue shaded part here, again, you see that the author has come in at the end, that at least the citation. He has remained in the sentence, but look at the difference. I am I've changed, I've foregrounded my own stance. This is actually called a stance adverbial. Um, I've changed my stance here to add a contrasting idea. So at the same time, as an object of research within applied linguistics, EMI can be considered a more recent undertaking, with Ernesto Maccaro in his 2018 volume on EMI reporting only 16 total published studies specifically on EMI before the year 2000, noting a lack of even a mention of EMI in pre-21st century reviews of content-based instruction. So I am first of all saying that this point of EMI being a recent undertaking is an important one, but I'm making that point not just by reporting what the data that Ernesto Maccaro presented in 2018, but also if you notice, and then this goes back to the previous video of the three C's, I've added this here that clearly connects uh, those two, or adds a connection, a kind of cohesion between the first statement in light green to the second statement in light blue. And so here is my voice, here and here. I've not foregrounded the other voices. I mean, I'm foregrounding uh, my voice, my stance, the I say. I'm building this up. I'm saying what they said, but I'm adding my voice to it. And if you recall, in the original version of this, there was no connection like that between those two. It was just there was no stance adverbial there. There was nothing that would clearly connect those two things, or showing what the logical connection was between those things. And so now I've added coherence and cohesion between those two things in a clearer way, and in so doing, I've also inserted my voice. Same here with this assertion of EMI can be considered a more recent undertaking. That was implicit here, that EMI has not yet been studied very much in applied linguistics, only 16. So that was implicit there, perhaps, in the same way that perhaps uh, uh, bricks being a stronger material means that it's harder to blow down. But the one little small word in the previous video, as you saw, made that clearer. Here, similarly, the same thing happens. We're adding this, which is, again, my voice as an author, I'm making that clearer. So I'm adding clarity. So I've got better coherence, I've got better cohesion, and I've got better clarity in all three, in both of those first two sentences, and that's happened through strengthening my authorial voice. Okay, finally, the third sentence here in this short paragraph. Airy has stated that little is understood about EMI and other related English teaching scenarios, such as content and language integrated learning and English for academic purposes. Again, the same problem with Airy coming in as foregrounded when he shouldn't be. Once again, in the improved version, you have him as just supporting my own voice, supporting my own discourse, and it changed to, indeed, there is still much to be understood about EMI and how it relates to other more widely studied and well-established concerns in applied linguistics related to CBI, such as content and language integrated learning, CLIL, English for academic purposes, EAP, and English, and even English for specific purposes, ESP. And once again, just by adding one little word there, I've added better coherence and cohesion, because with that little word indeed, it shows, it signals to the reader that I'm expanding on this idea. I'm elaborating on the previous statement. If you recall, in the original version, there was no such device. And indeed, you could look at this entire first statement as my voice coming through, because with this statement, indeed, there is still much to be understood about EMI and how it relates to other more widely studied and well-established concerns in applied linguistics. That is basically the most important point that I, the author, want to make in that first paragraph. That was my end goal to begin with, is to make this point. Before, I was letting Airy make that point, although it wasn't very clear. It may be implicit in my mind, but it's not made clear. But here I'm making that point. I've let the they say be clear. I've entered that conversation, and I have brought my voice out in that first sentence, that last sentence there, the one that's in bold, saying, asserting, therefore, indeed, there is still much to be understood about EMI and how it relates to other more widely studied and well-established concerns in applied linguistics. And so here you have how the three C's, coherence, cohesion, and clarity, and authorial voice, they all kind of come together here. And once again, when you revise your manuscripts, when you revise your introductions for this course and in the future, those are elements that you can look at and see. Okay, if you are citing research, um, that's great. But if you're doing it foregrounding the other authors' work without inserting your voice in the way I've talked about here, then it can be it tends to go along with having a lack of clarity, um, cohesion, and coherence, or conversely, the more you insert your voice here, the more there tends to be coherence, cohesion, and clarity. And those are things to look out for when you revise. Here you see now that this whole paragraph is now salt and peppered with my voice as the author. It comes out throughout the paragraph. This is something that, as was pointed out in Casanav's work, is something that doesn't come easy, doesn't happen overnight. It's something that is kind of develops. But I hope that now you have at least an awareness of it, and that you can therefore work on it as you write, positioning yourself in that universe of authors, right at the center of it. And when you go back now to your structured, if you use the form that was supplied to you, you can look at how you can first of all, see if the three C's and your authorial voice is coming out as clearly as it could be there, and begin working on polishing your introduction with these ideas, the three C's, and working on your authorial voice. And now it's your turn. Now over to you.